Hey everybody, it is Mike Schumann and Seth Tow here for the penultimate edition of One Opponent, One Position Group as we preview the 2025 IU football season. And today we are going to talk about the Wisconsin Badgers, who Indiana will face in game number 11 of the season, and the safety position, which is a very fluid position, even as we sit here recording on the afternoon of August 27th, just days before the start of the season. We'll get into that in a minute. But Seth, I guess starting with Wisconsin, I think you mentioned the other day talking UCLA that Deshaun Foster might be your pick for Big Ten coach on the hottest seat in the league. I'm not going to debate that, but I would say someone else who's right there with him is Luke Fickell, head coach of Wisconsin Badgers, who has amassed a 13-13 record overall and an 8-10 mark in the Big Ten as he enters year 3 in his tenure at Wisconsin, which is just not up to the standard that's been set over the last quarter century.
Yeah, I believe I gave that distinction to Mike Locksley at Maryland, but
Yeah, you might
mean,
have.
I
You
would
might
not,
have.
I would not dispute Deshaun Foster being in that group as well. And yeah, you're right. The Luke Fickell is going to have some pressure on him this year. It is not looking as bleak as it is for Maryland and UCLA for Wisconsin, but again, I mean, as you alluded to, like the expectations in Madison are always just higher than those other two programs. They have more history in football and have a lot more recent success, and just they generally expect to be pretty competitive in the Big Ten. And obviously, Luke Fickell, when they brought him in, was one of the hottest names going in the coaching market after everything he did over at Cincinnati, and it just hasn't really translated so far. So yeah, I think you're right that there's going to be some pressure on him this season. And really, I mean, Indiana's going to get them at what could be a really important time for him, depending on how things go. I mean, that could be a game that he kind of needs to take some pressure off.
Yeah, and I would say not even, because of where they might stand record wise, but just the idea that, Wisconsin is, a tier below Indiana, which a loss to Indiana would certainly suggest at that stage in the season. Not to mention the fact that they've lost their last 2 games to Indiana. I mean, this was just a series that Indiana not only was losing with regularity, was getting embarrassed more often than not. This was a Wisconsin program that dropped 80 on Indiana a decade or so ago. So this feels like an inflection point, with the kind of the status of IU and Wisconsin in the hierarchy of the Big Ten. And like you said, this game's going to come, late in the season, so it gets harder and harder as we do these to project just what these games will mean. But like you say, it could be Wisconsin and their head coach coaching for their job at that point. But they do return a fair amount of production from their offense, 68% back. They've changed coordinators. They've got what I would say is an upgrade at quarterback to someone who knows the Big Ten. So there are signs that they can turn this thing around, because I think the problem has principally been on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, well, before that, it's funny that you mentioned the 2023 game that Indiana won. Indiana could actually make it 3 in a row over Wisconsin, because before that it was 2020 when they went up to Madison and won in the empty stadium up there.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, Wisconsin did definitely make some changes offensively. Billy Edwards Jr. is going to be the quarterback this year, played at Maryland. And Indiana fans might remember, it was a few years ago, I think 2022, when he was with Maryland, Edwards, he came in for Talia Tagovailoa when he got hurt, and that was a really close game at that point. And Billy Edwards just ran all over Indiana's defense, and it kind of felt like a low point at that point for Indiana to basically give up a game-winning drive to the backup quarterback. But Edwards, has been more than just, the backup quarterback, in that instance. I mean, he was second in the Big Ten last year with 260, just shy of 262 passing yards per game, 15 touchdowns to 9 interceptions, 65% completion rate. I mean, the touchdown interception ratio, the completion rate, they're not going to, jump off the page at you, but they're decent, solid stats. And, those are numbers that aren't going to completely screw you over by having that at quarterback. And obviously, he was able to sling the ball around quite a bit last year. It was important to note also that Wisconsin's going to have a new offensive coordinator. They had Phil Longo there before, he came in with Luke Fickell, but Wisconsin's offense was so brutal the last couple of years that they swapped him out for Jeff Grimes. So that's also worth noting.
Right. Now, I don't know how much we know about Grimes, but it seems like Wisconsin is getting away, or maybe they need to get away from their reputation, ironically enough, that kind of built them into the power that they became with the power running game. That seems to have gone with Bielema over to Illinois. Fickell was more of a spread offense. People will remember him as the head coach at Cincinnati when they came to Bloomington in 2021, and they were more wide open. They had a quarterback who'd run, and I think they're maybe just a little bit of a program in a state of in search of an identity. Are they the Wisconsin of old, or are they the Luke Fickell, Ohio State / Cincinnati pedigree? I'm not sure, but I don't think that do they have what you would call a power running game. It looks like I'm looking at your notes here on the running back, and it's a transfer from Cincinnati, or transfer to Cincinnati, and then you got Darian Dupree coming in. They just don't have that big marquee name at running back like it seems like they had literally for decades.
Yeah, and obviously, in college football, names can kind of emerge out of thin air pretty quickly. And
sure.
I mean, when you look at the running back room, I know Cade Yakimelli did make some plays for them, I think last year. So it's not completely barren, we shouldn't say, but I mean, they're not. Look, Wisconsin with Phil Longo was trying to pull the air raid. They were really trying to get away from. They really were going against the grain as far as running the ball, and it didn't work. So, I mean, Jeff Grimes, you asked about him. Last year, he was Kansas's offensive coordinator. Kansas was 37th in the country in total offense last year. Rushing offense, they were 13th in the country. I think Devin Neal was their running back, and they had a pretty strong run game down in Lawrence. So maybe that's a sign that they're looking to get back to their, at least somewhat of their old ways on the ground.
And I was going back and looking at the series here. They what they'd like to do is get back to their old ways against Indiana. It was a total of 10 wins in a row against IU from a 2005 to 2017 span. Listen to some of the scores in that stretch of 10 games. They won 45-17, 51-3, 62-14, 59-7, 83-20, 55-20, 33-3, 52-17. Those are some of them. There was a couple closer ones in there, but that is just complete and total domination by Wisconsin to be now on a 2-game losing streak to IU, where they scored a total of 20 points in those 2 games.
Yeah, I mean, if Indiana was to get back in the win column here, this would be their longest winning streak against Wisconsin since the early 90s. They won 5 straight against Wisconsin from, well, I guess it started in 86 and then jumped to 89, 90, 91, 92. So it would be the longest win streak against Wisconsin since then. And I mean, like we've kind of talked about, Wisconsin for so long has just been, they've been one of the haves, and Indiana was a have not. And at least based on last year, Indiana's put themselves in the upper hand in that matchup.
Yep. And it's going to be interesting. Like I said, Fickell to me was like a great hire when they hired him. In my mind, can't miss, seemed to be, a perfect fit, perfect move for them, a logical step up from him from Cincinnati, where he had done such a good job. And You never know. Maybe it takes a couple of years. I'm just looking at these returning production numbers: 68% on offense, 26th, and 67% on defense, 16. So certainly some signs there. If Edwards can be right and the offensive coordinator change hits the right way, that they can turn a corner here this year.
And also worth mentioning the offensive line. Wisconsin's offensive line was really strong last year, fourth highest pass block grade in the country on Pro Football Focus, 38th in the country in run blocking. They have 3 starters back from that unit last year. So, like we've said a bunch of times, football is won and lost in the trenches. And, Wisconsin, for, whatever concerns you might have about, maybe the passing game or the receiver room or anything like that. I mean, if their offensive line continues to play well like they did last year, I mean, the floor can only be so low.
Right. Right. I think that's a fair way to look at it. Um, Interestingly enough, Indiana will have a couple former Wisconsin walk-ons playing in that game. Drew Evans was a walk-on offensive lineman who got a scholarship when he transferred to IU. Riley Nowakowski was a walk-on tight end who got a scholarship at Wisconsin and then carried that over with him to IU. So I suppose a little bit of inside knowledge will come with those moves, but probably not a massive distinction there. Obviously, Nowakowski's a little bit more recent with the Fickle connection, so perhaps he'll help out a little bit more than others, but he was under a different offensive coordinator, so that remains to be seen. You mentioned that the defense, anything about it stand out to you as you took a look at that?
I mean, their defense was good last year. I mean, it pretty solid. They were 41st in the country in total defense, but 40. It's the funny thing to me going through stuff like that is 41st in the country in total defense sounds pretty good, right? But it's only
Right.
good for 12th in the Big Ten. So, I would still say that, that's pretty good. That probably just says more about, how strong the Big Ten is defensively. But it really was the pass defense, the secondary for Wisconsin. They were 14th in the country in pass defense last year. So that had a lot to do with it. And, and also worth noting it, in the same breath, Wisconsin has 4 starters back in the secondary after they were so good, against the pass last year. So it could be a tough game throwing the ball.
Yep. I think, before we leave Wisconsin, it bears mentioning because I've seen people talk about this before, and especially in the context of Fickle in this kind of defining season for him. Their schedule is brutal. They've got 2 early games against non-power fours, but then they go to Alabama in non-conference game 3. They also go to Michigan. They host Iowa. They host Ohio State. They go to Oregon. They play Washington. They've got this game at IU. They play Illinois, and then they go to Minnesota. I mean, that's got to be among the most difficult schedules throughout college football, and it does leave you wondering where will this team be by game 11?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. There's a very little margin for error for Wisconsin. I mean, the way to look at that is Wisconsin absolutely has to take care of business in the games that they are supposed to win. I mean, we're recording on August 27th. I mean, they start tomorrow, which is a little crazy to think about. Their first game is tomorrow against Miami of Ohio. Miami, Ohio, Middle Tennessee. You get into Big Ten play, and you got a game against Maryland. I mean, even Washington, I would probably power rank Washington ahead of Wisconsin, but Wisconsin needs to look at that Washington game as, at home the week before they play Indiana. Wisconsin's going to have to look at that one and say, we need to win this game, because you're right. It's a really difficult schedule, and it'll be interesting to see, if Wisconsin is maybe just having some tough luck, but playing well against a tough schedule, like, does that factor into Fickle's situation? Like, does he get a little more slack if Wisconsin isn't putting up, a ton of wins, but it has more to do with a difficult schedule? That's just kind of an interesting wrinkle to all of that.
Yeah, and I would also say it's why you don't schedule a SEC game as part of your non-conference schedule, especially at home and home with Alabama when you don't know what the Big Ten's going to deal you in any given year. Um, I, I think it's taken on too much.
I mean, but like we said before, like we talked about before, how Wisconsin, it's only been a couple of years where they've really, I mean, maybe bigger picture, Wisconsin hasn't been at the level they really think they should be at for, maybe it's been a little bit since they've been at that level, but I mean, it's really only been the last few years that Wisconsin has kind of fallen more towards truly the middle of the pack in the Big Ten. And for what Wisconsin aims to be in most years, I mean, a game against Alabama, while obviously this a tough game. I mean, it was a home and home because they played Alabama last year too. A series with Alabama for what Wisconsin, aspires to be reasonably most years it is a helpful game to have, because if you pull it off, that's huge for your resume. So, and there were plenty of years, when you look back through the last, 10, 15, 20 years where a Wisconsin Alabama matchup is pretty close on paper. That probably is not the case now, but when these games were scheduled, I'm sure Wisconsin was not anticipating the team being like this.
Fair enough. Just to complete the schedule conversation, their remaining strength of schedule based on ESPN FPI is number 10, and it is the most difficult of all Big Ten teams. In fact, teams 1 through 9 are all SEC teams. So just to drive home that point, Wisconsin's going to be battle tested at the very least when they come to Indiana.
I mean, you can make a case that Wisconsin's Big Ten slate this year, I mean, even forgetting the Alabama game on there, you could make a case that Wisconsin's Big Ten slate is tougher than the draws Indiana would get when they were in the Big Ten East. I mean, this is a brutal gauntlet Wisconsin's got.
It really is. It really is. And, as a former Big Ten West squad, all I can say is too bad for them. They've all got it coming at some point. So let's pivot over to the Indiana safety group as we round out the position previews. We'll do special teams along with Purdue for the final episode, but we've got a little bit of breaking news as it relates to Indiana's safety group. As we record on the afternoon of August 27th, they've just put some new court documents in the Dallas County Court portal, and this is relating to safety Lewis Moore, who's sued the NCAA for an additional year of eligibility, and they just posted a temporary restraining order that is extended in all respects until 9 a.m. on September 10th, 2025, which means that Lewis Moore is eligible to play through September 10th, or through the 9 a.m. on September 10th, which in essence, just thinking about this, should mean he's eligible to play for Indiana's first 2 games.
Yeah. I mean, I cannot claim to know all of the legalese involved here, but that's how I also understood this ruling.
Yeah, it's an extension of the original restraining order, which I understood to mean he was eligible, and so logically he would continue to be eligible. We'll do more homework on this to make sure we've got it nailed down. But assuming that's right, it's a very interesting situation for the IU staff as they now get underway in a season and have to tackle what to do with a guy in Lewis Moore, who was, by all accounts, if not a starter, widely expected to play significant snaps. And now you're going to have him for 2 games, but you don't know if you're going to have him beyond that. So what do you do with that scenario?
We were talking about it before the podcast, and I kind of feel like this, at least for now, it might be like the worst case scenario for, I mean, obviously, an immediate, ruling ineligible wouldn't be good or positive, but at least for the Indiana staff, I mean, this is close to what, like a worst case scenario, at least for these first 2 games. Cause you're right. How do you handle this now? Because you have Lewis Moore for these first 2 games, but you don't know if you're going to have him beyond that. And if you knew that you weren't going to have Lou Moore beyond the Kennesaw State game, if you knew that you only had him for these 2 games, you would probably address playing time a little bit differently than you might if you knew you were going to have him the whole season. And it's just a really interesting scenario now. I don't know. I mean, Lewis Moore, was practicing with Indiana throughout fall camp. He, as far as I could tell, was, lining up with the ones. They, anticipate him being a starter, if they have him for the full season. It's just, Indiana's clearly going to have a backup plan, in mind, in place for if they lose Lewis Moore, to ineligibility at any point. And they have depth at safety. Bryson Bonds is about as experienced of a second teamer as you could hope for. And behind Lewis Moore, I would figure he'd be the starter, if at least early on, if Lewis Moore wasn't able to play. You also have the really intriguing true freshman Byron Baldwin Jr., who I would figure, especially if they knew they weren't going to have more, you figure he would probably get a longer look in the game and get additional reps and more playing time. So yeah, it's really interesting it's going to be interesting to see how they handle this. Like, do they just treat it like they have more normally? Do they have him out there with the ones the whole time? Is there a little bit of a rotation going on? Because, there's a give and take there. You don't want to, obviously, if you are going to not have Lewis Moore beyond week 2, you want to make sure that Byron Baldwin and Bryson Bonds are going to be able to have the reps they need under their belt to, be ready for Big Ten play. But on the other hand, if you're going to have Lewis Moore, you want to make sure he'd be ready for that too, and not cut him short on the reps he may need to be ready for the rest of the season. So it's a really interesting situation.
Yeah, it certainly is, and it's hard to read how Signetti and his staff might handle it. I mean, I could see on the one hand where he just, because these early games are a little bit more in the winnable category, that he might, go the route of giving the younger guys or less experienced guys the bulk of the reps, just with the the view towards Moore already has the experience, and those guys, in the event that Moore can't play beyond week 2, that get those other guys as much experience as they can so that they're ready if the situation arises that Moore ends up being ineligible. That would certainly be one situation. You mentioned a rotation. That's probably, in my mind, the more likely. Just kind of get everybody in and out of there. Especially the Kennesaw State game. It seems like on paper is going to be not very competitive. Probably a game where you can do a lot of heavy rotation, look at a lot of different things. Because this is a position where you mentioned Bonds is experienced, but he hasn't played a ton. I mean, he's just a guy that's played a lot of special teams and been kind of in and out of the second unit at times. So it's not like you got just a proven commodity in Bonds or Baldwin. I think you're going to want to get those guys as much work as you can in these first 2 games. And part of that, to just take a step back, is because the 2 starters from last year, Sean Asbury and Terry Jones, are both gone. But also guys that came in 1 year and started and proved that they could pick things up pretty quickly. So that's I guess a tip of the cap to the idea that guys like Bonds and whoever else might be able to step in and do something. But they do lose a lot of production. They also lost Nick Toomer, Josh Sanguinetti, DJ Warnell, Tyreek McDaniel. A lot of experienced guys are no longer with this team. So I would say it is quite suboptimal to be dealing with this situation right now with Lewis Moore.
Yeah, no doubt. But I do still think that there's, you're right that Bryson Bonds has mostly been a special teams player throughout his career, but he's, it's different. There's a difference between him and the true freshman Byron Baldwin. And, Bryson Bonds has been out there in college football, knows the what it's like to play in Big Ten games. I would imagine he'd get the nod, if only just for the experience, at least early on. But I mean, we can talk a little bit more, about Baldwin now, I guess, just, without any of the caveats, because Byron Baldwin has been, throughout fall camp, every time we saw Byron Baldwin, I think you'd agree, he was a really good looking true freshman. He looks like, if you didn't go into that practice knowing that Byron Baldwin was a true freshman, you probably would assume that he was a junior or something like that,
Yep.
because he just played with so much physicality, so much aggression, knew what he was doing. Really, he looked quick, looked like he had good awareness. I mean, he looked the part, which is kind of a bland way of just saying that he's a good player, but he looks the part. Like, he looks like he could be a really productive player right now for Indiana.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, he like his size, like he looks like a Big Ten safety. I thought people should go listen to Aiden Fisher's press conference on Tuesday evening. It's posted on the Daily Hoosier and on the YouTube page. Fisher was asked about Baldwin, and I thought what he said was really encouraging from the standpoint of Baldwin. It kind of sounds like he's been in Fisher's hip pocket for the last couple months, just trying to absorb as much as he can and really just be a sponge and try to be as ready as he can to play. I mean, I assume like all these guys, I know you knew about the Lewis Moore situation going back to the spring. I assume all these guys have an awareness of the potential that this was going to happen with Lewis Moore, and that their playing time could ramp up considerably. So I would imagine a guy like Baldwin is, already come in with high expectations because he was a 4-star recruit. And, just the fact that the situation was going on with Moore, I would assume he's kind of preparing himself mentally over the last couple of months for this very situation.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, somehow we haven't mentioned the name Amari Farrell while we've been talking about safeties yet. And it feels like we should probably talk about him too.
Ask and you shall receive. Here we go for YouTube viewers. There he is. Sometimes it's like some people are such a sure thing, like a Kamara or a Pons or a Fisher, that it almost feels like you don't have to mention them. It's understood. We dove right into the uncertainty, but there he is. So go right ahead, Seth.
Yeah. Well, the uncertainty is with Lewis Moore is the story with this room.
Right.
But I mean, part of why I think you can feel good about what Indiana, what the backup plan might be for Indiana is because of Amari Farrell and how steady he was. He was playing well at Rover early in the season last year, and then they moved him to the safety spot. And I mean, it was a seamless transition. He handled himself really well. I think he had 3 or 4 interceptions last year. He's got a good nose for the ball. He's a good playmaker. I mean, we talked about him a little bit when we were talking about the linebackers, that he's, he could kind of double as a linebacker a little bit with his build. He'd probably, if he was really playing linebacker, he might be a little bit on the smaller side. Mm-hmm. But I mean, he, in theory could, go back to that Rover position, the kind of hybrid linebacker safety role and, fill that role really nicely, just because he's a good tackler. He's a good playmaker. A lot of what you look for in a safety, you have in Amari Farrell. And just because he's kind of a steady presence and you don't have to worry about him too much usually, I mean, I think because of that, you can look at the depth chart and list, the way we put it in our preview was listing Byron Baldwin as the backup to Farrell at strong safety and listing Bonds as the reserve for Lewis Moore at free safety. But you could essentially just have both of them, Bonds and Baldwin, kind of be in the mix at free safety and not really worry about Farrell. Obviously, if there was an injury or something, that's another story. But I mean, between Bonds and Baldwin, you can kind of just figure out free safety between the two of them and not really have to worry about Farrell. I think that's part of why you can feel all right about Indiana in the secondary, even if they don't end up having Lewis Moore.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, another guy we're not really mentioning is Devin Boykin, who's going to probably slide into that Rover role that Farrell had for at least part of last year. And he's another very experienced guy, 6-year senior, 20 career starts at NC State. So I think, with him and Farrell as kind of the anchors, I think you just got to see how things play out, at the other spot. But it's, For me, it's kind of a theme on the back end of this defense when you're talking about questions next to Aiden Fisher, questions opposite D'Angelo Pons, and now questions in this Lewis Moore situation. I don't feel as comfortable with the defense as I do with the offense, and I think we won't truly know if there's an issue until we start getting into the Big Ten games.
Yeah, I mean that's fair. The other name probably worth noting in this position group is Jaja Boyd, redshirt freshman, who came in with a considerable amount of hype last season as one of the higher rated players in last year's freshman class. I think he was injured pretty much all of last season, and surely just with the amount of potential that was around him and that everybody saw in him coming in last year, he could be a guy to watch as somebody to maybe take a step forward this year.
Yeah, no doubt about it. He was the number one recruit for James Madison, the highest rated recruit they had, and he flipped over to IU when that coaching change happened. And I think everybody is very high on him. So again, I'm not trying to paint a doomsday scenario. I think if you do have Farrell and Boykin as the anchors, and then Bonds, Boyd, and Baldwin, the three Bs, as guys that you can count on to be solid contributors, then I think they're going to be fine. It's just the difference between being fine and having a guy like Lewis Moore, who's obviously, as the whole issue suggests, a very experienced guy. That as Signetti likes to say, there's a fine line between winning and losing, and these are the scenarios and situations that can often make the difference.
Yeah. It's probably important to note as well on Lewis Moore. I mean, situation aside, like on the football field, I mean, Lewis Moore was at Indiana in 2023 and really had a breakout type of season that year. He was really strong, a really solid player for Indiana, and then transferred out to Mississippi State, I believe, after
Ole Miss.
Or it was Ole Miss, right state, wrong school. Transferred
Yep.
to Ole Miss last year, and he really took a step back. It seemed like both in production and I think in playing time a little bit too. And it seemed like he wasn't the same player at Ole Miss that he was at IU. Now he's back at IU, and so it's not without any risk with him, even if he's in the lineup, because I mean, Indiana's banking on him being more like the player he was in 2023 than the version he was at Ole Miss.
Yep, that's absolutely a fair point. I agree with all of it. I think it ultimately just comes down to, how many pieces that you have to play with and find the right mix ultimately, which as you suggested, last year with moving Farrell around and other things that, the staff will do throughout the course of a season. And I have little doubt that at least Moore would be a piece of the puzzle. And he still very well might be. I don't know, based on, you probably haven't had the chance to read anything besides post on Twitter about the case, but I don't really have a good read on how this Lewis Moore situation is going to play out.
I have no idea, honestly. I would like, I'm the type that when somebody gets injured in a game, like, I hate being somebody that plays doctor and tries to, imagine or guess what the injury is going to be based off my completely amateur eye. It's the same thing with sort of legal proceedings. Like, I can't pretend like I understand enough of, I mean, I know what the case is about, and I know, what the situation is, but, I am not the person to ask for an opinion about, about all of that.
Yeah, and I'm clearly not either, because I would have told you that today would have been the defining point in the proceeding. I wouldn't have thought that the judge would have allowed it to go into the season, because playing in the season is kind of what's at stake here, and now we're gonna potentially play a part of the season, but maybe not all of it. So and then what does it mean if the judge says he's ultimately ineligible, but he played part of the season? I guess because of the case, he was eligible until deemed ineligible. I don't know. I'm with.
It's not like you haven't seen scenarios before where a player is ruled like academically ineligible kind of in the middle of the season. It wouldn't be any different than that.
Right. Yep. I mean, just a bizarre situation, suboptimal for
Yeah.
Indiana, and but I guess you can, if you want to keep spinning it to the positive, you're gonna probably get some guys get some good looks the first couple games, and then they should have clarity maybe before the Illinois game, which is really when this whole thing kicks off anyway.
Yeah. I mean, one way or another, we will find out soon. It's also with the Moore case being postponed to a Wednesday. I mean, it not that it matters that much for a game against Indiana State, but it's worth noting at least that week that now the case is rescheduled for. It's a short week for Indiana because that's the first Friday night game. So
Right.
they have even less time to kind of adjust based on whatever happens then.
Yeah, I can just imagine Signetti stewing about this because of how much he talks about, his process, and eh, this is like just a total disruption, and I'm sure how he would like things to go. But to your point, treat it like an injury. Injury uncertainty happens in college football every week, so there is some precedent for it.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much the only way to look at it. I think is just as if he's injured. It's just a bizarre situation that you don't see too
Right.
often in sports.
Yep. But that is what the NCAA does deliver with regularity. So,
Welcome to it.
yeah. Okay. Well, we've got one more of these to come up. Purdue and special teams, as I mentioned, we'll get you that. We're also going to record on Thursday our season long predictions. We'll bring back the intern, Owen Graham, for that. So look for that on Thursday. But for now, this will wrap up one opponent, one position preview. He is Seth Tow. I am Mike Schumann for the East 17th Street podcast and the Daily Hoosier. We'll talk to you all later.